Welcome to the Workflow Podcast. If you enjoy this show, please like, share, and or subscribe. And now, on with the show. Hello and welcome back to the Workflow Podcast for episode number 6 of season 3, all about improving your personal productivity. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at the S in the tires mnemonic, tires acronym, those spare tires slowing you down. And the S is all about shallow level work. So this extends to doing the easy things, the insecurity work, the work that when you sit down at your desk first thing in the morning, it's so much easier to check your email, to jump onto Slack, to check LinkedIn, to go on Twitter, see what's trending, go down some YouTube rabbit hole, do anything and everything outside of actual work. And this also extends to quote unquote work, so attending meetings, working on a certain presentation long past the point of diminishing returns, reviewing old emails, just doing all these things that are essentially easy but don't really help us move the needle at all. Now, when it comes to the nature of work today, I mean, it's changed so much in the past 120 years or so. I mean, if you were working 120 years ago, chances are you were in a coal mine, on an assembly line, in a farm, in a textile factory, something of that persuasion, and you could essentially draw a straight line between hours and output, presence and productivity. The relationship between work and the output was very linear. However, so much has changed since then. In fact, the World Economic Forum released a report which found that over the 20th century, the nature of work has shifted across 4 domains, and that is more autonomy, a more complex task scope, and that's important to remember because during the Industrial Revolution, if you were sitting by, say, an assembly line, you were essentially doing one tiny little piece of the puzzle. So if you were building cars, perhaps you were putting the treads on the tires repeatedly 1,000 times a day. Very boring work, very monotonous, very repetitive. However, nowadays, the scope of your work has extended quite significantly. We're doing all sorts of things. We're jumping from one task to another, one tool to another. There's a lot more complexity. There's a lot more thinking, which brings me to the third way work has shifted in the 20th century, which was cognitive complexity. Work is a lot more cognitively complex. It requires us to actually think, to get into flow, to apply our cognition, to learn, to connect dots between disparate sources of information, to figure how something may play out in the future, to strategize, to project. There's a lot more going on from a mental perspective than simply putting those treads in those tires. And number 4, interactive social interactions is the 4th way work shifted in the 20th century, and that just means that we have to work with so many other people to get our work done, particularly if we're working at a large organization. There are many moving parts, there are different departments to work with, and so on. Whereas if you are simply putting those treads on tires, you don't have to worry about anyone else. You're just doing your job over and over and over. Sure, there are dependencies either side of you doing that work, but that's not your responsibility. Your responsibility is simply those treads on those tires, and if you do that, then your job is done. Whereas if I need to put together a marketing campaign for a new product I'm taking to market, well, chances are I need to talk to the product designers, the marketing team, the brand team. Maybe I've got some designers who are going to create the ads, some marketers who are going to come up with copy and figure out the best place to run those ads and what strategy to employ. There are so many different moving parts to it when I'm working, particularly in white-collar professions today. And this brings me to the flow state, right? Because essentially, myriad, the famous behavioral psychologist, found that we are about, well, he didn't find this. McKinsey actually found that we are about 5 times more productive when we are in the flow state, that state of total immersion in one task when the rest of the world simply ceases to be. myriad coined the term the flow state back in 1975. Now, the thing about flow is the upper limit for it is really about 4 hours a day. Whether it was violinists at the Berlin Conservatory of Music given 4 hours a day max for deliberate practice, whether it was Charles Darwin coming up with the theory of evolution in just 4 hours a day of work, or whether it's a study from the 80s which penned scientists, 3 groups, one working 20 hours a week, the second working 35 hours a week, and the third working 60 hours a week. It pegged them against each other. And it essentially found that the 20-hour-a-week scientists were the most productive of the lot. In fact, twice as productive as the 35-hour-a-week group. The 60-hour-a-week group, it might not surprise you to learn, were the least productive because they were just burnt out. And they would just fill their days up with all sorts of inconsequential insecurity work, making themselves feel like they were being busy, but really they were not. Whereas the 20-hour-a-week group, given the shorter time frames, it really acted as a forcing function, and it got them to work on the high value work and then call it a day after 4 hours of intense focus. And that's why nowadays it doesn't really make sense for us to be managing time. What we should be managing is attention. But most of us are lucky to get just 1 hour of flow, or 1 hour of what Cal Newport calls deep work, or 1 hour of what you might call the zone, even in a glorified 12-hour workday. Now, why is this the case? Well, we've mentioned the spare tires, but one of the big reasons is really shallow level work. Now, this is essentially email, Slack, Microsoft Teams, Zoom calls, meetings, all of this stuff that's basically, I think Scott Belsky from Behance and currently at Adobe, he calls this insecurity work because it makes us feel busy, makes us validate our jobs, our salaries, without really having to make us work all that hard. Now, the average person, according to Gmail, sends and receives 121 emails per day. Now, we're checking email on average once every 6 minutes and spending about 3 hours in our inbox every day. So, I mentioned in the episode on task switching, every time you switch, you suffer something like a 23-minute cognitive switching penalty. So if I'm checking email every 6 minutes, then clearly I'm not spending much time in flow at all. Similarly with Slack, the average Slack user sends about 94 messages per day. Again, if you work that out over the course of the day, say you're working an 8-hour workday, that's about, say, 12 or so messages per hour, which is 1 every 6 minutes again, similar to email. 1 every 5 minutes, actually, so it's a little bit worse than email. Again, if you're sending a message via Slack every 5 minutes, you're clearly not cultivating time in flow. You're not cultivating attention to do what you're really paid to do, which is to think and to create value rather than simply communicate all day long. Aside from that, our phones, we are checking our phones sporadically throughout the day, and most studies show that the average screen time for any given person is about 4 hours a day, which works out to be 8 weeks a year. So that's no small amount of time, right? And now this is all of the internal stuff, but then we have meetings as well. So meetings that don't need to happen, meetings that are too long by default, meetings with no set agenda or outcome, and meetings that really aren't aligned with our goal. Now, the average executive is spending about 15 to 25 hours per week in meetings. Now, this is absolutely insane in terms of the amount of time we're spending in meetings. But when you combine all of this, when you combine the fact that we're spending 4 hours a day looking at our phones, 3 hours in our inbox, checking our email every 6 minutes, sending messages in Slack every 5 minutes, sending emails every 6 minutes or so, it's no surprise that we can be busy all day long, but come the end of the day, have very little to show for it, but a mounting workload and exhaustion. Yes, this stuff might make us feel good in the moment. It might make us lull ourselves into a feeling that we are busy, but kind of like Doritos, which might make us feel good in the moment, quote unquote, but make us guilty and feel lethargic and crap after we've devoured an entire bag of Doritos. It's the same with insecurity work. We feel bad afterwards. We know we really haven't done any great work, and come the end of the day, we've not really done ourselves any favors because that workload of actual real work that's going to move the needle, that keeps mounting. And we're not getting any closer to our goals. So this is shallow level work. It's easy to fill our entire days with it and feel busy at the expense of doing any real work. And in subsequent episodes of the Workflow podcast, we're going to talk all about what we do to get around these traps that permeate the modern workday. And with that, I'm going to bring this episode of the Workflow podcast to a close. Till next time, peace out.